How to find a flat using math and notion. What we will cover is first, scientific modeling, second, mathematical functions, third, what is notion, and fourth, how we implement these things we just discussed, the flat search, into an actual kind of program that spits you out the ideal flat. First, scientific modeling is the process that basically says reality is pretty complex. And if we want to break it down into a mathematical function, into a model, which just happens to be a mathematical function most of the time, then what we do is we take the elements of reality that are the most important for the model, but leave out the other ones that are kind of unimportant, or at least not as important as the other ones. And then we say that this function now could potentially prognose reality up to a certain threshold. So if we now, because we cannot predict reality, we kind of have to find a way to predict reality. Therefore, we simplify reality because it's too complex for making a one-to-one basically model of reality with all the different variables that are out there. And then we just say, this model now is our model of reality, and this is what we work with if it has enough predictive power. So now, why mathematical functions? Because math is just numbers and things like these, and math is actually the way you then implement a mathematical model. So how do we implement flat search? On the one hand, so let's just imagine an equation. An equation is a basically very easy function, and the result is on one side. And it doesn't really matter, we can exchange the both sides because there's an equal sign in the middle. But if we have a normal equation and we now say that this equation is dependent on different factors, on different variables, you could also say. So the variables combined with the cofactors in front of them, multiplied by the cofactors basically determine how important this is. So if you want to search for a partner, for example, and you say it's very important that they don't live on the moon, then this might be your cofactor. And if the person lives on the moon, then the cofactor could be 0 or I don't know. Depends on how you define this factor. So now, the idea is this. If we want to search for a flat, the ideal result is one flat, one single flat that is the result. That is the result and also already the booked flat, probably. So on the other side, we need the variables that are important to us. So what could these variables be? The first one would be the rent, maybe. The second one would be the location. When it comes to the location, we already see, or as you look into the location, you already probably realize that the location is one variable that has codependent variables on it, you could say, because location itself also determines the city. So if we think of location, let's just say it's a certain point on the globe. And this certain point on the globe has attached to it already a city, probably, or at least a city around it, and then also probably a state, and also a country, and then maybe also a bigger country conglomerate like the European Union, or are there actually other country conglomerates like I don't think so. The United States are a country of its own, so therefore let's just go with the European Union. So now the idea is, and also this location determines a lot of other factors already, like the weather and the proximity to supermarkets and the proximity to the next university and the proximity to your workplace. So of course you could also all make it dependent on the location variable itself, but the problem is that then the location determines so many other things, and you don't have a really easy way to implement this. So therefore, I would say that all these different things that are important to you, like which country it is and how close it is to your workplace, could be either already implemented in the location variable or could be another variable entirely, even if these variables are kind of playing into the same direction. Because, well, it's the same city then, it's the same location and things like these. So now, we basically have everything we need. We have the one result on the one side that is our one flat we want to search for. We have the equal sign in the middle, and on the other side we have the variables with their cofactors which determine how important these are. So what we now do as humans is we don't just calculate things, and then we have the one result on the other side, because a mathematical calculation would probably spit out some number in some unit. But what we actually are searching for is much more kind of, I don't really have a word for it because I haven't thought about it that much, I think, but the idea is this: we are not really searching for a variable, for example, and a function, therefore, that gives us a certain number, or that includes all the flats out there. What we are searching for is a very limited function, because chances are we probably don't have time to research 20 different flats just to put them into our function and then see which one is the best. So therefore, I mean, this is what we are already doing without external help, not really external help, but program help with Notion, for example. We are already kind of applying different methods to simplify reality into a model and then to actually spit out something out of this model. For example, if we often also use heuristics. So this already goes into behavioral economics and also behavioral psychology. But what we often do, for example, if we decide whether we want to move to this city or want to move to this flat, we replace the difficult function, whether this is the optimal flat for us, with a very simple function, which then is, do I like this flat, or do I like the feeling of this flat, or do I like the smell of this place, or do I like the flair of this city? Of course, this is also something that you should maybe include if it has a psychological effect on you, and if you cannot say this effect on me is something I can control, and therefore you maybe should also include it. So maybe nice flair, the city, or nice view, this apartment, or I like being on the upper floor, things like these. So now when it comes to applying these things, let's first talk about how we would kind of apply it if we just used our brain, and then we talk about how I actually applied it, and also how I will show you more or less by talking about it how I implemented it into Notion. Maybe I'll make a different video about it in Notion hands-on, but the problem is that all these locations I researched are basically, one of these is already the flat, and therefore I would have to make proxy ones, and I don't really know if this is worth the effort. So therefore, now let's talk about the run and gun way, you could say, and the first way, the way in which we just use our brain. So if we have these different variables, and a person, for example, your partner, you're searching for a partner instead of a flat, and the partner lives on the moon, then you could define the location as the location has to be within a certain range. And the certain range now could be that other planets, for example, are just excluded. Also, if the person in the future maybe lives on Mars and you live on Earth, then that could also potentially be a problem, because there is a lot of traveling time in between. So long-term relations usually have it a little more difficult, especially if they are on two different planets. So now, what is the idea? The idea is that we define knockout criteria. So let's just say a variable has a certain range, and this certain range, let's go back to not location, because location is kind of difficult, as we already found out. Let's just say it's the rent, and the rent goes from 0 to 1,000. Now, of course, this is dependent on the apartment size and also on the location, especially the city, and also how close to the city center and how close to the countryside, or how far away from the city center. But let's just say the location is not, it's too complex, therefore we just take a look at the rent. This is what I'm trying to say. So it goes from 0 to 100. What you now could define are basically knockout criteria. What are knockout criteria, mathematically speaking? If we have a solution, not a solution, we have a solution, but first we have maybe one-dimensional or two-dimensional function. What does this mean? A one-dimensional function is just a function that has one variable. A two-dimensional function, for example, a certain point in a plane. So if this is a plane, so a plane, not a plane that flies, but just a plane, basically the ground floor of something. So now, if you have a point on here, then this point actually has two coordinates. This coordinate may be known as the x coordinate, and this coordinate may be known as the y or x2 coordinate. So x1 or x2 are often used, and also what is used is x and epsilon. So, or y. It's not epsilon, but y. But why is it not epsilon? So if we have this point, what we now basically are having is a solution, because the solution is determined by these two input factors. We have a certain input factor of x and a certain input factor of y, and this gives us a solution on this plane. Of course, you almost probably, almost probably, know this as a graph on a paper. But what you also can do is turn the paper over and then you have a plane, as we said already. So now a two-dimensional function with two variables, x and y, has a two-dimensional representation of the solution. And the solution is this point in this plane. A three-dimensional now would have a point, but in a space. So if we have three different ones, then this is x1, x2, and x3. And what this potentially means for us is that we go a certain, so first we go here. And if we then find our value, we then move into this direction. And if we then find our value, let's say this is this value, then we go into this direction, which I just realized I have already done. So therefore, let's start again. Here. Then let's go here, we are still in a plane, and the third direction is just moving up. So basically, you could think of it as flying, trying to find a certain point in space, or in the air, in mid-air, for a plane, for example. Let's arrive at this point in the air. So now, this is a three-dimensional function. The problem is just the flat function is probably more dimensional, so therefore it doesn't really have a solution in space, since normal space is just defined by three major things. And of course there are maybe higher dimensions depending on the current theory of physics, maybe string theory, but this becomes very difficult soon, and therefore let's just move back to the flat problem, which was a little bit easier. So if we now have the price range of the rent, which is from 0 to 100, as we already said, we have basically a one-dimensional function. We could also say it's like this, it's just a line, and on this line we move up to the target, maybe. It's not the target, but just the highest value, which is represented or included. And then we have the other one. What we now do is, if we think about things or these variables like humans would, then what we would say is, I don't have more than $500 for this apartment. And then we just cut off all the possible solutions that include positions or values of this variable that has more than 500. What you essentially are defining is, take out everything above 500. The question now is 500 included? Or so we would have this equal or bigger sign, and yeah, well, that's just how we now cut off these certain things. In terms of solution space, think about it like two dimensions again. So in two dimensions again. So if we have a certain point here, what we now define by saying, for example, the rent, let's say the rent is the y-axis and this other one is, I don't know, doesn't matter right now. So if we have this point and we just say, here is 0, here is 500, and now we say everything above 500 right in the middle is cut off, then we just have halved our solution space. And this is a strategy we use either in Notion or also in real life to determine a solution. If we have 10 solutions, for example, 10 flats, 10 possible flats or 10 possible solutions, then what we now do is we just cut out basically the solution space. Think of it like a cake, like a square cake. This is a square and it's a cake. So what you now do is you say less than 500. You cut out half of the cake. And then what you actually are doing is you take, so let's say you have the cake again, and you divide it into 10 different subsections. The 10 different sections, so you cut it, and then you have 10 different subsections. And then you try to find the subsection which has still a flat in it, a flat with a certain point. The point, again, is the different values of the different variables we have. So now, what we are doing is just cutting out enough cake until we find a solution. Just like, and what this means for us is that we then have a solution because we defined all these criteria. Of course, it becomes a problem when you cannot define this criteria, because you're like, okay, this flat is 500, but if the view is really nice and it's also a really nice location and it also has a double bedroom, then I would be paying more than 500. This is not how it works, because if you, at a certain point in time, then because you open up more solution space again. And that's a problem, because then you cannot find a solution. So therefore you have to define your constraints. Otherwise you won't find a solution. And that's what also makes human thinking about these problems so difficult. Because we are not defining permanent constraints. We are saying, okay, but if this is this, and this is this, if this is this, then maybe I would pay 750 because it's so good. Or I would also think about maybe just having 10 square meters, and this would be enough for me, but only if the rent is above 250. So by defining these chains of conditions for possible flats, I mean, we could also use them to derive actual constraints for single variables. But if we have these multi-variable constraints, then it becomes very difficult to solve the problem in our heads. And this is also why it is so difficult to solve problems like these in our heads, because we don't take one variable each and then define what these variables should be. And this is why it becomes so difficult. So now let's look into Notion and let's see how we could implement the things we just said, the mathematical function that is a model of reality, and what the problem is searching for a flat, or rather finding a flat. So what is Notion? Notion is basically, think of it like Excel, but it's also a merger between Excel and so Excel is the proper pronunciation in, I think, American English or British English. I switch between those two all the time. So we have Excel, and on the other side we have, it's actually more British English. I just am realizing right now. So we have Excel, and we kind of merge it with a CMS called WordPress, which is basically a blogging thing. You could just say it's like a blogging thing, like Tumblr or things like these. So basically you have entries in a database. Think of it like a table in Excel. And these entries are basically the things that define this database. And these entries now can have certain properties. And these properties, you could also think of all of these things like there is one flat equals these different properties multiplied by how important they are. And how important they are is now defined by our cutoff criteria or also constraints. So you say, on the one side is a flat, and this flat, so this is one flat, and then this flat equals to one variable. So the rent is 750, the square meters or the feet square or square feet, I think this is the right word, are this many, and this is the location, and this is the agent that you usually call if you talk about this flat, and this is the portal it's listed on, or the platform it's listed on. So basically one entry is one flat. So we now have to do the research part and also the thinking part. What is actually important to us? What are the criteria we not only the criteria that are obvious, but also the criteria we actually that are not obvious and we nevertheless want to include, because we would them include either way, or we would screw the whole model and make our own decision in our head either way because we like the city. So if we just like the city, it would be more useful to have a criteria or to have a property, a variable basically, that says, okay, how much do I like the city? From 1 to 5 or from 1 to 10? And then you have a value again, which you can use to then define functions that gives you the right output. So now, how do we... So first of all, again, we have these properties in Notion. Each property is an actual property, and this is so funny because, well, it's a property and it's also called property in Notion because the word obviously has different meanings. So now, if we have this one property in Notion, this one flat in Notion, the first thing we now do is research all the stuff. Research the possible flats. And of course, for researching, you already have to kind of define in which direction you want to go to, because you cannot include all of the database of one platform. Of all the listings on one platform is something you possibly cannot do. So therefore, you already are applying constraints. Like, I won't search for flats that are over a certain square feet or square meters, and we also don't search for flats that are in the range of above 1,000. So therefore, you're already applying constraints. So therefore, the properties and also the flats you input into your database are already constrained by your previous choices. So basically, you're already filtering and cutting out cake. So the next step is then cutting out the cake in Notion. After you basically defined what is important to you, the rent. So these are just the variables, not the actual constraints. So you say the rent should be in between this and this, and then you select all the flats that are here. But in Notion now, you just basically establish a property that is a number property because it's a number, and also maybe a currency. So it has a unit, it is a number with a unit, and then you just input the data. And this takes quite a while, depending on how your different criteria or how many different criteria you have. So let's actually look into what I have as criteria. In the order I actually listed them in Notion, and these are the criteria they are done. They are then listed in basically this order. So the first one is the country. You could also say the country is not that important, and probably all of your flats are in the same country anyway, because this is part of the pre-selection process where you already cut out all the cake that is beyond the borders of this country or on Mars. So the next part is the city. And when it comes to the city, there is a speciality of Notion that comes into place here. So basically every property entry can now also be kind of a blog. And now every property entry so the blog is basically a page. You could also think of it as a word page where you can insert pictures and you can format the whole thing, but you can also link other properties again, other database entries. But what you also can do is just link it to another database. So what I did is I created the city, but the city property, the city variable, is another database. So what this allows me to do is to, for one, select basically from the different cities I have in this database, a certain city, for example, like New York, and then I can go into this other database or just click on in this database onto the page Dresden or New York or Paris, and then just say that I want to include certain things in here. And I could also again have selection criteria for the city, or I just input information about New York, about Paris, about Berlin. It doesn't really matter. It could also be London, I guess. So this means you can sublink these databases and make it more complicated, and therefore in the long run maybe easier. So let's look into the other one. I have the name. The name is usually the name of the listing. And then within the listing itself, what I usually do is I just include a link. So the name is kind of a link property that is actually clickable, and this makes it possible that I can then click on it and see if it's still available, for example, and this makes it very easy. What I found out in researching dozens of flats, because I actually did another research process in the last year and this year again, but this year I actually found a flat that had a solution. Last year I just didn't find, because all these things were just so frustrating, because it's really complicated if you think about it. I didn't know if I stopped before. So the next point is the address, and the address actually is also linked. It's linked to a web link, and the web link is a Google Maps link. So every time I click on the address, it automatically opens up Google Maps, and I can research how long the distance is between the address and the next supermarket, the next gym, the next workplace, the next study place. It doesn't really matter, or the next kindergarten. So therefore, the address is also a link. Then I have the state, and the state is just the state of the actual property. So it could be that I already wrote them. Then so you can basically define that you have a certain set of answers, and these answers are basically the values this variable can take. And one, for example, is that you have already a contract. One would be that it's an active listing. One would be that the listing is deleted. So therefore, it would make sense to later on define a filter. So the filter is then the selection criteria that actually is the function in Notion. But what I'm saying right now is that you can select these different states. You can also define these different states and say, for example, it's an active listing. It's a listing I already contacted. I already had contact with these people, or it's very likely that I will get the flat, or things like these. So now the next part is the company. And the company is just the landlord, I guess. It could be a private landlord or also a company as a landlord. Then I have the type. The type is the type of flat. Is it a flat without furniture? Is it a flat with furniture? Is the rent all inclusive? Or do you actually have to pay extra for water and for heating and for energy? Or are there additional housekeeper fees or things like these? Then the next part is the gym, which is kind of important to me because I want to have a gym in close proximity. Again, when it comes to behavioral psychology, it becomes very apparent after it doesn't become very apparent. The research suggests, which is a phrase I thought about while cooking yesterday, because this is actually a phrase that is very secure when it comes to having, it doesn't have the same statement power as this is the case, this is the fact. But the research suggests that the more close, for example, a gym is in terms of distance, the less you have to overpower yourself if you don't want to go to the gym, because it's less of a way, therefore it's just easier. And this makes it more likely that you will actually stick to a certain behavior or habit, like going to the gym. So in my example, I researched the different gym chains that are available, and I also put, so for example, it could be, so in my country, in Germany, there are different fitness chains, and for example, if I found one, I just put in the name, and then basically the rounded up kilometer entrance. So this means, for example, I have another gym which is not part of a major fitness chain, and then I have just one. One means 0 to 1 kilometers. The next one is the proximity to the city center, because this kind of is also nice to know. And this is a number. It's a number with a comma in between or a point in between, so therefore you can also do calculations with it, theoretically. The next one is the equipment the place actually has. You could also call it feature. And for example, has it already a bath? Has it already a kitchen? Does the whole building complex maybe have a laundry room? Is there a bike storage? Are there items to rent? Is there a parking space you could potentially rent? Are there community spaces? Is there a room you can rent that is a music room? Or is there a study space, for example? So now the next point is the market, and which is actually the supermarket. And when it comes to researching all these different things, what I found usually useful is to just either have a certain set of defined things. Like when it comes to the supermarkets, here are the supermarkets I'm looking for, and let's just see how close the next supermarket of this is, and then the next supermarket of this brand, and so on. Or you could define a certain range that is basically on the outskirts, not on the outskirts, but so you define a circle of 5 kilometers, for example, around your address, and then you just list all the things, all the supermarkets, for example, that are within this range. Then the next part is I have a small calculation in here, which includes different parts. The first part is the cold rent, which is a concept I'm not exactly sure if this is the same concept in all the countries. It's basically the rent that is without water and heating and energy. So therefore I have this rent, which is usually in the listings. Then the next part is the rent and fee. So basically sometimes there is a fee, like a fee for the person who actually gave you the apartment, who contacted you, not really contacted you, but who talked to you and therefore made the deal. So therefore, sometimes there is also if you buy a house, I mean, the same things apply, obviously. And then you also probably have to buy not buy, but actually pay a certain commission to the agent. Then you have the deposit, which can also be used for calculations and also is just very easy for comparison. And then you have the additional costs or extra costs, and it would also make sense to list them to then calculate a total monthly rent. This is actually one of the next things. Also, I included laundry, because if there is a laundry in-house, the laundry has certain prices, or if there is a laundry in close proximity, or if you actually buy a washing machine, and then you can also say that I buy this washing machine, it will probably work for this many years, and then you input the price, the monthly price that comes out of this. Then you have a total rent, which I then have as a function. Just like in Excel, you can also define functions like this box plus this box equals this box. It's actually not that hard. So then public transport, for example, is there a train nearby? Is there a bus station nearby? Is there a tram nearby? Or is there a subway nearby, or an underground, or a metro? All different words for basically the same thing. And the same. So I have this in here, and it's the same as before with the supermarkets. It's just within proximity of maybe 5 kilometers. When it comes to the airport, it would make sense to maybe include the airport, which is probably not in proximity of 5 kilometers, because then it would be a downside for the apartment, I guess, because of the flying noises. Then you have maybe the space, how much space it has. It's also, again, a number, but I don't know if I already mentioned this. I just have two different space properties in here, which doesn't matter right now. Then I have a rating that is completely objective and personal. I can put in here stars from 1 to 5. In Notion, you can, for example, set just again these text-based defined values from basically plus to 2 plus. So you just input the plus, and then you have 1 plus, 2 plus, 3 plus. So the next thing is maybe the level, on which level is the flat. The next thing are the drugstores nearby. The next thing are other stores nearby, like clothing stores and like posting stations. And again, the same principle applies. If you find a station that is 3 kilometers away, that is by DHL or by Deutsche Post, for example, to German posting offices, then you just include them here with the number 5, 3, and so on. Then I have a property for physical activity, which then includes the gym, but the gym is actually predefined by me in another property. But it includes, is there a basketball court nearby? Is there a football court nearby? Is there, for example, a swimming pool close you could use, or a climbing hall, or a tennis place, things like these, or a tennis court actually. Then internet is a very important thing these days, so therefore I usually include the internet speed. This takes often a lot of research, since many people, especially if they don't have good internet speed at their flat, just don't input the internet speed, and then you find out it's only 50 megabits or 10 megabits. So therefore, especially in countries like Germany, you don't, it's kind of a running gag, because, well, Germany doesn't have very good internet everywhere, compared to South Korea, for example. So now, which is very good internet availability almost everywhere, I guess. At least it's better than in Germany. So now, what else is there? Maybe a library, maybe a move-in date. When can you actually move in? And in Notion, again, you have the possibility to define a property as a date, which then gives you a format just as a date, just as in Excel. So therefore, I think you understand the concept. Then, is it a flat share? Is it a solo share? If this is important to you, you can also put them in an order if you want to see them in a certain order. So just input numbers from 1 to 3, and then you can actually do two things in Notion. The first one is sort, so you can sort the different properties. And then if you have the order, you can just sort them alphabetically, which also includes sorting them 1, 2, 3, and then you just have them in a certain order for the purpose of viewing them at once, maybe. Also, medical, hospital, closest hospital nearby, different doctors, for example, and social. What social activities can you actually do? For example, is it a big city where tourists come through and you get to know people in your everyday life, or things like these? Then also, the contact maybe would be something which doesn't really define, is not really an output of this whole function, is not really a variable, but much more it's just a notice to you, a personal note, where you just can very easily access the property, and there are the contact details, which makes it very easy to kind of then maybe find a flat. Then what else is there? The city size, maybe a defining criteria, for example, 100k, 500k. It doesn't really make sense to make it a real entry. So basically what I again do is I try to model reality also in the city size, and I just say it's 10k, it's 50k, maybe just use 10 and 50 as the heuristics, maybe also 25 or 2.5 as a heuristics. And then it results in having 1 million, having 500 million, having 5 million, 2.5 million. So therefore, just keep it simple, I guess. Then is there a storage? Which would also maybe be important. So, but this again could be in the equipment. What I meant here is there a storage facility nearby. So storage facility is basically self-storage, where you can store your stuff if you, for example, move away to another country for 3 months, and then you can subrent your apartment and take out all the furniture and your belongings and just put it in a storage space, which then would ideally give you a little bit money back. So now, in total, as a summary, finding a flat is a really complex problem, because it basically has an impact, an effect on almost all major parts of our lives, on the social, on how we can travel, on where we can work, where we maybe can study, which friends and people we meet. If you go to a city that is on the countryside, then you will probably be more likely to only meet people that are living on the countryside. Whereas if you go to a city, the actual fluctuation of people in cities is just a lot higher, because of maybe international airports, because of international companies that also are in the city, that have an office in the city, of people who are traveling because they have important talks in the city in front of audiences, of musicians that are in concert halls in the city, of people driving from the countryside to the city because there are concerts of these people called musicians or comedians in these concert halls. So therefore, choosing where you actually live is one of the major decisions probably you have to deal with. And therefore, I think it also, first of all, made it approachable. It made it not easy, because it's still a very, very effortful problem to solve. But for me, it just basically allowed me to write down all the different thoughts I already had or didn't have, and just write them down into a Notion table, into a function. And now, something I left out until now is the filter function in Notion. The filter function is the function that we actually use to spit out these things. What we now do is we say, market 5 kilometers can be either, for example, this supermarket in close range of 2 kilometers or 1 kilometer or 3 kilometers. And then you include all the markets with, for example, Lidl 1, Aldi 2, Penny 2, up to the number of 2. And everything that is not included in here, then the property is not included. So basically what you are doing is you are sorting through these things, not sorting, but filtering through all the properties you listed, and then you find the ones that are the important ones. That's the filter function. And this, again, is not really a mathematical function, because in a mathematical function, ideally, you would vary all these different variables just a little bit, just maybe move outside of Dresden, or maybe move outside of Berlin, or things like these, and then see how the total value basically looks, or what is the impact on the output value. But this becomes very complicated, therefore we simplify it with kind of human thinking by just defining knockout criteria and constraints which are used in filters. For example, for the rent, as we already said, you can just go into Notion and then just say the rent, so the number in the property rent should not be more than 500, and then you just filter out all of these. So basically, the approach I took was just, first of all, to include simple constraints like the city or like the country, and then just as my research went along, I just included more and more, and then it became clear I had to contact this person. I actually contacted only, so in terms of numbers, because I kind of standardized it by going for the same company who rented apartments in different cities. What I did is that I brought it down to a number of 5. Then I contacted all these different people, and they gave me again more information about these things and asked about Wi-Fi. And then I narrowed it down even more. And as you get information, you can narrow it down even more. And then I had 3. And then I basically, out of all of these 3, I contacted them and said, basically, I want to rent. And then a little bit more became clear, and then I had a solution. And this is how you find a flat with mathematics and Notion.